Good morning. We are close to the end of the written Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3, on page 1476, reviewing it the second time, also in context of the other Maimorim that we've learned, that will help us understand what the most likely conclusion would have been, since the Rebbe Rashab did not finish writing the Hemshech. So we are on page 1476. And as we wind down, what has been discussing, literally beginning from page 1466, so we're talking about 10 pages ago, is the contemplation of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Baruch Shem Kved Malchus Elolam Bod, how that leads, which will lead to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha B'chol Levavcha B'shnei Yitzarecha. So the second half, the V'ahavta, he doesn't discuss in Ayin Beis because he stops after the contemplation. But in the Maimorim HaMakbil L'Shevis, he does continue. So what does the contemplation consist of? Understanding how existence is really godliness. Initially, it's concealed from us. We're an independent consciousness. We're, in the words, tachtenim, and all of the divine is concealed. But through our avodah, and namely here the contemplation of Hashem Echad, come to discover and realize that, number one, that there's a godly energy within each one of us, what he's calling now the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. Then we go even further, and we discover that there's the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, which is even a higher level that is beyond existence altogether. And then we come to understand that both of them, from God's point of view, are like one, Kel Deus Hashem, Yichud Tata and Yichud Elah. God wanted both these tracks, as we've been learning here, two levels of Ayin, the Ratzon, as he put it. There's the Ratzon, Atzmus. There should be a Gilim and a Etzem, V'loi liyez b'chinas Makal Yesh, which is not a Makal Yesh, is beyond existence. So in other words, within the world of Metzias Nimtza, in the world of expression, of manifestation, that Atzmus is beyond everything and beyond, that's a given. But even in the level of Oyer, there's a level that is not even a Makal Yesh. For Habeis, there's the Ratzon that there should be a Gili that is a Makal to the Yesh. And then he said, the Yesh Leimer, Shezeu b'chinas haratzon li is b'chinas eris. That the first level is a ratzon that there should be oyer, which is the etzem lamayla from kelim. And then there's a ratzon, there should be a oyer that creates the containers. Creates, as we said, helps bring it into being, like misavis, from the thickness of the light, become the kelim. That's where we're up to. One more point that we learned, the difference between the Parsa and the Tzimtzum. So that just briefly, that on one hand, the Tzimtzum, as the Eitz Chaim says, is for Atzilus, the Parsa, the partition is for Bria, which means the Parsa in a sense is a deeper concealment than the Tzimtzum. And yet, in Torah it says that Tzimtzum is a greater leap. So that's exactly how we explain it. When you talk about a leap from the quantum leap, the Tzimtzum is bigger because it's going from Ein Yisod before the Tzimtzum. So a complete different divine, only soul, an exclusive divine consciousness to allowing room for another consciousness. But the air that comes after the Tzimtzum is an air that still retains and originates from the original air. It's diminished, but like he said, it is and it's a gilim in etzem. The Parsa, on the other hand, actually creates is a true partition that creates a separation, and it's like a different mechusa. So it changes the eir altogether, because now it's an eir that is relating to the makabel. Not just that it leaves room for another entity, as we discussed at length yesterday, in the previous classes, I should say. Okay. So we're going to continue from middle of page 1476, the line that begins hakelim, a little lower than the halfway mark, the gam yesh leimer. And the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along the text. So he says, Gam Yeshlemer. What's the Gam? Because before he said Yeshlemer, that is the difference, that the Rotzen of Oyer, that's Be'etzem higher than Kalim, and the Oyer that shapes and helps define and bring the Kalim into helps bring them into being. Now he says, Gam Yeshlemer, Shezeu Sheidish B'chinas Alma Diskasa v'Alma Disgalia. That these two tracks are the root of the hidden worlds and the revealed worlds. So in Seder Shtalshalos, there are many different levels, obviously, but in general terms, Alma Diskasia refers to usually the worlds that are, well, it's all relative, so there's no particular, Atzilus could be Alma Diskasia compared to Biyah, but in general, Alma Diskasia means hidden worlds like the sea versus land, where all the creatures of the sea are concealed. So we say Moshe Rabbeinu came from water, Min Hamayim Mishtisir, and that's his name, means his neshama came from the hidden world. In an example of the human faculties is the difference between thought and speech. But bottom line, it's two types of realities. One is concealed, one is revealed. And he's going to explain. Shari b'maimer de posach aliyo. In the maimer, in the essay, if you wish. So maimer is the discourse. Posach aliyo is the Hagdama to Tikkun Ezer, which we say on Fridays, right before Shabbos. Oimer antu dafikos, antu you, Hashem. He's the one that fikas, that from him emerges. Lan hoge behun almid stimen de lois galmin, the almid is galin. So there he defines. He's talking about Hashem, and from him emerges to govern, or to manage, to rule the hidden worlds that are not revealed, and the revealed worlds. So you see there, this distinction of two types of worlds, two types of realities. Yesh lemer, the alm is stimen b'chinas ha'er shalamayla b'chinas hayesh. So now the yesh lemer, what he's doing is defining these two tracks. So as they are lifnei at tzimtzum, or even after the tzimtzum, we have more or less the definition. One is energy that's beyond existence altogether, the root of das elyon yichudei law. The other is an energy that relates to existence. But now he's giving it more substance by saying in Shtalshalos itself. So he says, Yeshlemer, that the Almin Stim, the concealed words, is coming from the Oyer, the first level of Ayin. That's higher than the Yesh. Shagam Mo'er Zen Nesava Rak. Shagam Mo'er Zen Nesava. This Oyer also created something. It's not just a Oyer that is just shining and it's not relating to existence. It also creates, but Rak Sheisava Silei B'chinas Mitzias. That what it creates is a creation that's not something that you can define with substance because it's a hidden world. Ukidu HaMoshel, and here he gives the example, as is known the example of the creatures of Alma Diskasia, Medogim Shebiyam, from fish in the sea, Shemuvloim B'mei Hayam, they're absorbed, they're engulfed and immersed in. Muvlaim literally can mean also swallowed, but it means they're completely immersed and engulfed and embedded. I mean, I like the word actually absorbed in the water, in the waters of the sea. So when you look at the water, you don't see the fish. When you look at the fish, they're all part of the water. That which refers to as a muscle, that they're completely connected to their source. Yichud abitl betachlis, utter unification and nullification or sublimation. So what Chassidus explains is that the Nuvraim Shebiyam, the fish, are an example for Nuniyama, for the Neshamas, that from Alma Diskasia, their whole being is absorbed in their source. Whereas the creatures on land, even though, yes, they exist on land and they need to breathe, but you don't see them being immersed in their source. They're independent creatures that walk this earth. As he's going to say, the Nikra Almid Stimin, and this is called concealed or hidden worlds. They're concealed and hidden. Meaning there are worlds but they are not yet emerged. They haven't yet emerged as being an independent entity. They're encompassed within the core. They have not yet emerged outside of the core to be an independent entity. But they are an entity, but it's an entity that's completely absorbed within its source. The Alman Disgalian, and the second level of worlds, this is already the world of like land. This has been created where it's a separate, independent entity. That's where the second level of that has kavyachal, so to speak, emerged outside of the source. That it already now is applying itself and becoming a source for the yesh of existence. So the two tracks of air that he said, one creates the hidden worlds and one creates the hidden concealed worlds, and one creates the revealed worlds. So the world that they create is commensurate with the type of energy it is. Since it's an energy that's beyond existence, so the existence it creates is a hidden one, hasn't yet developed into a defined entity. The energy, the divine energy that relates to existence, creates an existence that can be an independent, has independent consciousness, independent entity. Now, the root, and both these levels are there before the tzimtzum, like we learned before, like the teacher has within him his own intelligence and also the intelligence that he's preparing to teach to his student. So they're both kedem atzimtzum, b'chinas iskalus b'atzmus, but they're both, as we learned before, are completely encompassed in the etzem because they haven't yet emerged. And then there's no distinction of levels. It's like one that is all united and encompassed with within Atzmus Ein Sof. By the Simsum by Parsa, and through the Simsum and the partition, Nechlak lebeis madregas. Like he said before, then they get separated into two levels, two tracks. The b'chinas ha'ayin shel hayesh bo b'chinas havdalah. The ayin of the yesh, which means the lower level of ayin, becomes like separate, uberichuk min ha'atzmus, and somewhat removed from atzmus, meaning its consciousness is not the atzmus consciousness. It has its own being. Again, we're not talking about from the perspective of Atzmus. We're talking about from the perspective, once there's the Tzimtzum and Parsa, Lahavas b'chinas yesh nivra. In order to create an independent entity called a yesh nivra, an entity that is an existing, tangible entity. And of course, the other Ayr is the higher level of Ayr, which does not create a yesh. It's beyond being a yesh. That's complete bittul mitzias. Or like he said earlier here, from there we have the Alman Distimin, Alman Diskas. Okay. So what he's added now is that basically besides the fact there are two tracks, the two tracks actually have not just two different manifestations. One is Yichud Elah, one is Yichud Tov, but they actually create two different type of realities. Okay. Any questions?
I have a question. If the Alma de Iskalia, the revealed world, is preceded, that is, comes from the Alma de Iskasia, the concealed world. I get that the two separate tracks were conceived, if you will, conceptually within Atzmus prior to before the Tzimtzum, but as a like in the Seder Hishtalshelus, is it one revelation of light that becomes transformed? He says through the Tzimtzum, that the Tzimtzum and the Parsa yields the second track of light that relates more to the Yesh, versus prior to the Tzimtzum, it's all relating to the Yesh Hamiti. But or are these two separate tracks that somehow are independent of each other? That's where I get a little confused.
This is the whole discussion, the last 3 pages. I would just suggest you read them again because that's exactly what he's been explaining at length. And I would also suggest using the example that he gave. The teacher, before he teaches the student, in his mind, all his intelligence is one. But you can't yet discern the fact that there's part of his intelligence is how he understands the idea, and part of it is how he's going to convey it to the student. So before there's a tzimtzum, meaning before it materializes, before it actualizes, it's all one in his mind, basically. And then comes a tzimtzum, as he elaborated at length, where now he's going to be feeding a particular energy to the student, and the other energy then. So basically, before the tzimtzum, he calls it's not niked and it's not nivdal. You can't distinguish, and they're both basically God's will. God's will for an oir that will be beyond existence, and God's will for an oir that will be within existence. But within the Godhead, so to speak, before the tzimtzum, it's all like one, as he says here.
Yeah,
It's all about God's will. It's all, as he said, Ratzon. I would just simply, because this is something that is a deep concept, and I would just really read it again and again until you get it. It's not going to be explained in just a line. I would just read it, and you'll see he really covers it pretty. I mean, it's literally almost 2 pages. So I would just suggest reading it again. And
yeah. The problem is every time I think I get it, I feel like I haven't gotten it. So
go back to the example and see if the example works for you before
the
you
example,
try.
The example works very well.
And that's how it is with God. The example he gave is to understand that's how it's Lamaila as well. That's how God did it. So there's level of Atzmus before all these Ritzanis, before he wants anything, conceptually. And then there's 2 tracks that he, from the outset, as God says, I want to manifest, that manifestation is going to take on 2 forms. First, it's within him, and then the tzimtzum allows them to become reality. I gave many examples for it. The artist, the architect, the way the architect envisions the whole structure. There, it's all one structure. Then when you actually start building, the plumbers are not the electricians.
Yes, no, I hear you loud and clear. It seems if one uses inductive reasoning, because we talk at the end, or as you assemble the end that hasn't been finished by the Rebbe Shtab, that the ultimate yichud is the yichud of the separate yichudim, yichud tat and yichud ila. So that implies that they must derive originally from one track of light. There may at the end, at least from our perspective.
He made it very clear it's not that case. He says they do not derive from one track of light. They derive from one Atzmus. But Atzmus, as soon as there is, that's exactly what he said.
I know, that's where I get confused. Yeah.
So because there's a level before God wanted either of them. That's not what we're discussing. We're discussing the ones God wants. He has 2 desires. One for an oir that will remain beyond existence, and that will be always the case. And not from there emerges the second one. And immediately, he wants also the second oir that relate to existence. So they both are tracks from the highest levels.
Yes, but at the same time,
not, like the teacher, they're not yet discernible because it's all in the teacher's mind still.
But
until
even
the symptom, you can't discern between the 2.
But even when they do become discernible, there's something osmistic about both. Obviously, I mean,
that's a different discussion. Not necessarily from our point of view. We have to see them as 2 separate, and we grow. Like I said, it's stage by stage. You ask me how we understand how they become one. I would wait till we finish the Hemshech, and I'll explain that later. Right now, let's just stick where we are. Right now, the point is, from the outset, you have 2 tracks, but they're not discernible. They're all one, like he says, miyuchad, ba'atzmus ein sof, and through the tzimtzum of the Parsa, they divide into 2. What happens next? Let's learn on, and we'll see.
Okay, thank you.
Omnom. Now comes the qualification back to what he said earlier. This distinction is only from our point of view. Haparsa mafsekes hidak legaba nevroim. The separated partition is only from the perspective of the nevroim. Av legaba atzmus ein shum hevdel lehefsek klal. So besides for the fact that it originates from Atzmus, who's completely unified as one entity, even once there's a Parsa, the Parsa is only from the point of view of the recipient, the Nivraim. But compared to from Atzmus' point of view, there's no difference. There's no separation and no interruption at all. But Ershu Mokala Yesh, and the that is the source for the Yesh, the Ayin Beis, that second level of Ayin. From that perspective, it's completely unified with Atzmus Ein Sof, mamish like the first one, because they're both God's will and desire. It's not like the first level of Ayin is closer to Atzmus than the second one. They both didn't have to be, and God willed them both. He desired them both. It's from our point of view, there's a major difference between them, because one relates to us and one is beyond us. So there's that distinction. So the Parsa does have an effect, L'gaba Nevroim, but not L'gaba Atzmus. V'im Kain. And if that's the case, so this is now like the next level of his bonus. The first level of his bonus is there's a das tachten and there's a das elyon. There's Yichud Tata and Yichud Elah. Now he's saying, you start contemplating from God's Atzmus perspective, Im Kain, Kol Mashen Nisava Memenu. So therefore, everything that came into being from Memenu, from Atzmus, Haru Gam Kem B'chinas Bitl V'Yichud B'Tachlis. So since both energies, including the one that will create existence, is completely being yuchad with Atzmus, so everything that comes from it is also being yuchad b'tachlis. So in other words, to go back to the example of the sea and the land, when it comes to our perspective, the fish are clearly completely immersed in water. Creatures on land are not that way. That's very clear. But from God's perspective, even the creatures on land are also really immersed, except we don't see it because there's a tzimtzum. So we see a separate entity. But in truth, they're all part of the yichud, the higher level of yichud b'tachlis. V'hainu. And that means, shebchinas ha'ayin shala yesh, meaning the ayin of the yesh, the divine energy that relates to the yesh, v'hayesh shenesava, and the very yesh that's created by it, hadihem k'moi b'atzilus. So even though we're talking about biyah now, bria and biyah, they're like an atzilus, sha'eru b'chinas yichud, v'gam ha'kelim b'chinas yichud b'tachlis. So from that perspective, from the top down, from Atzmus' perspective, they are in a state of yichud, and also the kelim are utterly and unequivocally united. Like the Maimer Chazal, he brought the Maimer from the Maimer from Zohar, rather, that he brought from before from the Geras HaKedesh, that you are one with your energies and you're one with your containers. Before we was talking about the process of creation, so the containers are necessary because God is creating existence and existence for it to be an independent entity and have a distinct definition. The Kalim channel it and tailor it that way. That it is tailored toward the Kalim. But from the point of view from above, it's all, even the Bria, even the Kalim, even Bria, the Yesh itself, is also one like it is in Atzilus, where the Eris and Kalim are all one with godliness. One second. Telling us to look earlier about the Kalim of Atzilus, where he spelled out that they're a level of Yichudei Law. Even though generally you think Kalim compared to is Yichud Tata, but not from the perspective from above. From below, yes, Eris and Kalim are like two tracks again. Just like in itself, there's the beyond existence, the within existence. So Kain hu mamish gam b'biyah. So exactly as it is in Atzilus, from the perspective of godly perspective, it's mamish that same way b'biyah. So what he's introducing now is so-called the bird's eye view, how God sees it. So by him, the Parsa does not conceal. They're all part of that one divine energy or divine reality, you could say. Yes, God wants two, and it's Simpson, but that's for our point of view. But if you want to look through the lens of Atzmus, even Biyah is the same bitl as Atzilus. Now you don't hear this often in Chassidus, because Chassidus doesn't talk about from the perspective of Atzmus. It's talking about from our perspective. But here he is discussing it that way because he wants to lead us to the ultimate unity of how it is, the Beis Deus, Kel Deus Havaya, they join together, which is going to be discussed now in the last section as we come to the conclusion. Any questions?
I was just going to say, Rabbi, that so it seems like it's becoming clearer that everything is the same from the only way we can say everything is the same to Atzmus. In other words, there are no distinctions, right? I mean, everything is,
Yeah,
we
but we're
only
not
perceive.
Atzmus. That's the thing.
I
The one
know,
little
but I'm
caveat
just
is
saying,
we're not Atzmus.
well, of course not. But I'm just saying, so to just to try to understand it from the bird's eye view, as you say, we need to have distinctions in our minds because that's the way we perceive things. But can we
Well,
just
listen,
say,
if we had this perspective through and through, we wouldn't exist.
right?
Then all you have, God wants us to exist,
I
wants us to have
understand.
independent consciousness, free will, and make choices and grow. But he wants us to understand how it's his perspective. It's like he's opening up the secrets of his own reality, telling us something. So
Hmm.
ultimately, the goal is to get to try to understand God as best as we can. And that itself is relative, obviously.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
And I was going to go even further, and this is going to get more and more, I would say, more and more profound, more complex in a way. So that's why I want to again qualify by saying the fact of the matter is to think about your own reality. Our own reality is not at all this perception. We barely can make it, as I said, through a day or even an hour where you don't think about yourself. So let alone to think it from this perspective that all of existence, no matter what level, is all godliness. We have to understand that we are on a level where we are a yesh and a mitzias. That's the way we were created. That's exactly how God intended it. However, we don't have to remain stuck there. The goal is to get out of your ego and get out of your own self-perception and self-interest and grow. That's the ultimate goal. The Rebbe Rashab is relying that we understand that. Doesn't have to remind us of that every minute because that's the whole process here. But he is taking us now, especially as we come to the end of Ayin Beis. Remember, this is 1,476 pages. So all these 1,476 pages, he was speaking about the bitter of the Nefesh Habamis, of the Yesh. So, but where does it ultimately lead to? Where are we headed? We're headed to a point where the Yesh can understand levels of godliness. First, tailored the Yesh, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, till to understand the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, and then come to the third point that they're really equal. But if you really think about it, are we really at that level? So that's why this has to be processed and applied in a personal way to each one of us in our own way. That's why I've mentioned many times. You have to find examples in your life where sometimes you're aware of godliness, but not to the fullest extent. Then there are moments, the high points in your life. Let's say Yom Kippur at the end of the day by Ne'ilah. Let's say at the birth of a child or at the marriage of a child. I mean, there are times where we become elevated to higher states of consciousness. So this is really describing different states. And each of us, relative to our level, will have these three levels. The Das Tachten and Yechud Tata, the Das Elyon and Yechud Elah, and the joining of both of them, which he's now going to explain. It's still pretty short. It's only a half a page left, but there's enough to work with here, and it needs a lot of explanation. But just keep in mind what I just said. This is all relative to where you are. Not everyone's going to understand what we're saying here the same way. Now, the more you learn it, the more you can relate to something that is beyond. Because remember, the very definition of consciousness means it's your consciousness. So even when you are able to elevate to a higher state of consciousness, it's still yours. The question is, how high can you go? Can you get to a point where you completely can set aside your consciousness and completely see it from God's consciousness? Not that simple. Relatively speaking, yes. But completely that way, that's of course highest neshamas can do that. So each of us is going to have to work it out on our level. But he is describing these levels just as a statement, and then everyone has to apply it depending where they are. Like I often say about b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. Can you define the three levels, what they mean in your life? The difference between love, b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, and b'chol nat, with all your soul, and with all your might, with all your all. That's all part of this Aveda. That's what real Aveda is. It's understanding the rungs of the ladder as we climb from one level of consciousness to a next level. But he's going to discuss it now on the highest level possible. So right now he said that from God's perspective, Biyah and Atzilus are equal. The Yichud is equal. Not from our perspective, from God's perspective. But now he's going to say something more. Well, Eid Lamayli Yeser. And even higher than that. Because in Atzilus, it's still Oris and Kalim. Yes, they're both completely united with God. They have no other agenda. Like we talk about the Ovis or the Merkava. The Ovis, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. They were like a chariot. Completely transparent channels of divine, transparent channels of the divine in this world. But they were entities. They existed. Yes, they were in a state of Bittul Mitzvah. So he's going to say like this now. Shakeim da Atzilus. Because the containers of Atzilus. The Gamma Elim is Biyah. And also the worlds of Biyah that we're discussing here. When you talk about where they are rooted, before the Tzimtzum, they are like what God is allocating. We say Ashara B'Keach, remember Shir Atzmei B'Keach, where God envisioned in potential what existence would be like. Lifnei Tzimtzum, the Shir B'Atzmei B'Keach, Kol Ma She'osid Li is B'Peil. That he envisioned within himself, within his own consciousness, that which will come later. That's the root of Atzilus, the Kelim of Atzilus and Biyah, as it is before the Tzimtzum. Hariyesham Sheresh HaKelim, that means he's envisioning an existence. So there's a root for containers, Va'elimus, and a root for the worlds. Va'kol Eina B'chinas Mitzias Klal. It's not at all a Mitzias yet, because it's all the way he's envisioning it. It's all part of his consciousness. But it's not completely seamless because he is envisioning something. So in this context, when we're talking how Atzmus looks at existence, so the same thing, Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiyah after the Tzimtzum, Harihu Kamoy Ba'ashara B'Keach. Bli Shem Mitzias Klal. It's how he's envisioning it. It's not how it manifests from our point of view, so there are different levels. It's all how he envisions it. Ki im b'chinas yichud b'tachlis. Okay, I have to review this myself once again, because I'm not sure what he meant then. I thought he was going to say that there's a level even higher than Ashara B'Kayach, but I may be wrong about that. So I want to see how this evolves here. Let me just see something here.
Maybe he means it's united as he envisions it.
Maybe.
It's one concept, even though it ultimately
Yeah,
devolves.
I understand. I know exactly what that means.
Yeah.
But do you think the problem here is time? I mean, it's all happening all at once. I mean, the only way we can perceive.
That's why we keep using the word conceptual. It's conceptual.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah,
a matter of time. It's just different levels.
right. I
One
think
second.
yeah, sorry.
One second. Yeah, I would say that's exactly what he's saying, that there's two levels here. First he started saying that everything from the point of view of Atzmus, so the Ayin Beis is like the Ayin Aleph. So both the Ayin of the Yesh and the Yesh of Biyah is like it is Natsilis. And even higher than Atzilus it's all like it is in the way he's envisioning it. So that's correct. I would say that's for Eid that it's all. In other words, the first point was that the way they exist in Atzilus, the Biyah is Biyah, the bitl of Biyah is like the bitl of Atzilus, but it's an existing entity. Now he's saying it's all the way it is in the way he's envisioning it. So there is a Sheirish HaKelim. So you can't, Atzilus, you cannot say there's no Metzias. But Nashara B'Koyach, you could say there's no Metzias, because it's all how he is envisioning it. So that's correct. The reason I am still struggling with it, to be very honest, is because he began saying that the distinction is from our perspective. And from Atzmus' perspective, Ein Shum Hevdil. So to me, that sounded like he's talking from Atzmus' perspective, not just Hashara B'Koyach. But clearly, he is going through different levels here. In other words, level one is that from God's perspective, Biyah is like Atzilus. And furthermore, they're both like as he's envisioning them, and there's Tachlis HaYichud even higher than the way it is in Metzias HaElemus after the Tzimtzum. So, in a sense, what he's saying is that from God's perspective, there are also levels. And that is valuable because that means that helps us being able to find handles. So first we can say, okay, from God's point of view, let's say there's no difference between a grain of sand and the whole solar system. But that's still an existing entity, and it's all equal from his point of view. From our point of view, obviously there's a difference. Then furthermore, in his mind, as he envisions them, there's no difference between the grain of sand and the solar system, not because we're not talking about existing, because it's all within his envisioning. So it's a deeper level of unity because it doesn't even have Metzias. Whereas the first point is that they exist, but they're equal. Again, I'm not sure if that's what he means here, but it sounds to me that's what he's trying to say, because he is speaking from God's perspective. So then why are there levels? From our perspective, there are levels. But I guess it's helping us. My assumption here would be, I'd like to see how I taught it the first time, that he's telling us, even from God's perspective, you can go through stages. First, you could see that things are different and they all have a divine energy. In other words, the grain of sand has a divine energy, the solar system has a divine energy, water and fire have two different divine energies, but they're all divine. Then you come to a point that this one, they're all equal from the point of view of the divine. And then you come to a point that they don't even exist. They're all how God envisioning it, and they don't even have substance altogether. That's what it sounds like. But I want to see how he goes further, because it's not finished. He's in the middle of the discussion. But we'll see. And we have to be careful here, because since we don't have a lot of, there's only another half a page, it sounds to me that he is rounding it all out here and not leaving anything for imagination. But we don't know. But that's what he said so far. So that's the Eid L'Mayla Yesod, at least as I understand it right now. Okay. Okay, the next section is even more complicated, but let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything before I continue. So I'm now on top of the last page, 1477. Oh, he's going to go back to the Moshel. That's good. Okay, so here's what he adds. So from this perspective, now comes the question, so how does God see creation? We said earlier, if you remember, Bereshis bara Elokim, God created a world. So fine, you're saying that the world he created is exactly, the Elikus within that world is exactly the same as the godliness that's beyond existence. So is he seeing an existence? What is existence from that point of view? We understand that it's the same level of yichud. That's not a question. It's all one seamless yichud. But does God not see existence altogether? It's as if from that point of view, nothing exists. So this is what he says now. He says, Ve'in habriya, from this perspective, Ubchinis is galus bilvad. From our point of view, Bria is yesh ma'ayin, mamish. Because our existence did not exist on those higher levels. It's a new novel existence that was created. But from God's point of view, All of existence is just an extension of his will. Like he said, he wants to have a yesh, he wants to have an ayin that relates to the yesh. And that ayin is same as the ayin that's beyond existence. And furthermore, not just like an Atzilus, but hashara b'kayach as he's envisioning it. So what does Bria mean to him? So he's saying it means a Galus Bilvad. It's only a revelation. It's like, in other words, he's revealing something from within himself. The Bria Uloshan Gilui, because Bria, in addition, of course, to the meaning that to create, also comes from the word Gilui, ukamoi ubora oisam. So there's a says ubora oisam can mean he created them, but it could also mean he revealed them. The kamoishu batzmuse kenu bob is galus. So in other words, when God said, "I want to create existence," basically from God's point of view, not through the tzimtzum, not the way we see it through the tzimtzum. God is basically saying, "I want something to emerge from me," which, with the tzimtzum from the perspective of the creation, they will have a dependent consciousness. But from God's perspective, something is emerging. That's called Bereshis Bara. He created existence. But it's only as galus, it's only a revelation of one of his faculties, so to speak. I don't want to use the word faculty, maybe not the right word. He doesn't use that word, but it's a revelation. And from God's point of view, exactly as it is in Atzmus, that's how it comes out Beis Galus. So whatever existence is, and there is an existence, there is a Shemayim, Bereshis Bara Elokim, a Shemayim, Va'aretz, Yehi Or, Yehi Rakia. But from his perspective, whatever emerges is exactly as it is within his core. Everything is encompassed in the core. Because in reality, it's only through the tzimtzum that we sense ourselves as a separate entity. But in truth, and from God's perspective, nothing goes outside. Yitzi of Izgal, nothing really goes outside or is even revealed. Everything is Him. However, it's a Him how He's manifesting in His galas that we will call a Bria. So you see, this is not a simple few lines here. This is quite complex. Now, I'm not surprised at all because this is the end of Ayin Beis, and the Rebbe Rashab is, I don't want to say the word letting loose, but he's basically opening up all the what do we call them? All the chambers, all the floodgates, as they say, and really going to the highest, deepest levels of understanding how Atzmus sees existence. So I want to obviously explain this at length. And we did, now I recall when we learned it the first time, I discussed this at length, and I will do it again, not maybe as long as I did then. And then we went over to Torah Shalom, if you remember, which I also taught inside, where he discusses also what is existence from through the eyes of God. What is he seeing? When I say seeing, I don't mean physically seeing, but what is existence? You can't say it doesn't exist because he wants a real world, and when we do a mitzvah in this world, it's a reality. It's not a delusion. It's not some mirage. But at the same time, it's not an existence that's outside of him. So you have to say it's something that he put into place, but from his point of view, it's just another expression of Atzmus. From our point of view, it's an expression of a separate entity that will work at trying to recognize the Elokus within it and even the Atzmus within it. That's from our point of view. But from God's point of view, he's calling it a Isgalus, and it's all Isgalus and all part of who he is. Now, what still needs to be understood is what's the difference between this and Ashara B'Kayach? Is that the same thing? We have to say it's not, because envisioning existence is already a level. There's a level we know that's higher than Ashara B'Kayach. We knew even Ola B'Ritzeinei is a level that God desires something. So you have to say that there are levels here in the God, so-called God consciousness itself, where God is conscious, envisioning. There's levels before the envisioning. I don't think he's going through all of that here, but it's important to qualify. What he's going to do next now, and I'm going to stop here before we go on, we'll continue tomorrow, is he's going to go back to the moshel of the Mashpia Makabel to understand this better. Because using a moshel is definitely going to help us get somewhere here. So he's going to say, V'yuven zeh, Commission is baril ba'am moshel, Commission is baril ba'am moshel. But I'll do that in the next class, where he's going to explain the difference between how a teacher understands the idea that he's going to teach a student within his own consciousness and how it actually is understood by the student. Because that's the distinction here. how it's all within the etzem, and then how it comes out and is expressed to something that has an independent consciousness, like a student. There's plenty to discuss, as I said, including, of course, the obvious question is, so what about the very fact that we sense ourselves as independent? Is that real or not? Based on this, you could say that's only because we're blinded and the Tzimtzum doesn't let us see. But that's why it's important to understand that the Tzimtzum Nikra Kelim, as the Alter Rebbe says in Shayachid V'Amunah, the Tzimtzum is also a divine faculty. So even the very fact that it conceals and allows us to be independent is also a reality, because that's God's power. It's not like someone else came and hid God's energy from us. It's God himself is hiding that energy. So that's also part of reality. And that's why existence is a Metzias, because the Helam is also a Metzias. But we'll talk about that more as we discuss it, just to round it all out here. Okay, now I'm sure, as this is pretty, as I said, quite
intense.
Yeah.
Can you take questions?
Yeah, but remember, if the questions are to explain this, I would wait till we finish, but go ahead.
No, this is more broader philosophically. It's a little bit chutzpahdik, but it said L'Shem Shemaim, so forgive me. If we're created to think and feel separately than God, what makes us think we can even make sense through Chassidus of the concept of God's conception of reality? How can we overcome our own independence?
Because the same God that made us independent also gave us a soul, gave us created us in his image, gave us plenty of things that are divine. So the same God that created us as independent also gave us plenty of tools and faculties. And more than that, he gave us a mitzvah called know me.
Mm-hmm.
Feel me, experience me, and let's have a relationship. So that goes hand in hand. The purpose of existence is that make a home for God in this world. It's not just independent consciousness as an end in itself. The end is that the independent consciousness, through its effort, should access its own divine faculty. And we have thousands of different resources. We're taught the entire Torah in our mother's womb. As I said, we have a chelik elikam imal mamish. We have divine faculties. We have reminders of God in our lives. But it is a battle, as he explains in Tanya, and it requires a lot of work and effort, but that's the goal.
Yeah, that was very well said. I asked mainly because I'm trying to think of, it was very helpful, by the way, thank you, how to explain this to, let's say, the uninitiated, because when you speak this way, they stare at you like you're from Mars, and it's hard to get across to
I wouldn't begin by discussing this. I would begin by asking a person, do you think you have a mission in this life that's more than just your self-interest? If they don't feel they have a mission outside of self-interest, you're not going to get this across to them.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step is a person has to ask themselves in a soul search, why am I here? If I'm here just to serve my needs, which frankly most people are doing in their lives, that live their lives that way, then yes, they're not going to move much. That's why often it takes a wake-up call like pain or suffering, God forbid, that wakes people up out of their reverie, out of their comfort zone, or they have a spiritual epiphany or something else happens. But it's true. We live in a world that it can be, look at the world. There's violence. How could people hate each other? How do people go to war? How do people, the justices that people perpetrate on each other, because self-interest is what dominates them, and they're unable to transcend their own self and their biases and prejudices. So I wouldn't begin by talking about this page per se. I would start from the beginning. Where do you stand? That's why I say you have to always begin. What if an uninitiated person says to you, are you completely absorbed by God all the time? Or do you have an ego? Do you have self-interest? Do you ever, and the answer is, of course, we all do. But I also understand that I want to remain there. I'm looking to grow. I'm looking to become a more selfless person, a more giving person, a person that transcends my own small, little, petty ego. That's the discussion. That's the context I would have the discussion in. And then you could lead them as far as you wish. But without that, you're gonna have two. You said you're gonna have two different, maybe like ships in the night. There won't be any
Yeah,
common
exactly.
denominator.
Very well said. Beautiful.
So I think it all starts with purpose. That's why I always focus on mission in your
Mission.
life. Why am I here? You know,
When
and
you ask about,
I think most intelligent people will say, no, I'm not just dog eats dog, survival of the fittest, the selfish gene. But the truth is, there are scientists and others that are very, well, let's say, materialistic and very self-absorbed, and they're not willing to go out of their comfort zone. And I understand why, because the Tzimtzum is a very, as I said, is a very
powerful.
much alive and kicking, and it's very powerful.
When you,
There's
real quick, Robin, quick follow-up.
sorry.
When you start with the
What
question,
I would say, I remember once talking to, I'll say one more thing I want to say. I was once talking to someone who was just adamant and obstinate, refused to even acknowledge anything outside of himself. He said, we're all for ourselves. Basically the biological evolutionary theory that even when we're altruistic and giving, it's also because it serves my interest. And at some point, I stopped arguing. I didn't really argue. I stopped the discussion. I smiled. He says, why are you smiling? I said, because when I speak to you, I really appreciate the divine power of Tzimtzum. God did such a good job that you can be so convinced of something and it's all divine. You're a product of a divine concealment. He didn't necessarily like what I said, but that's how I saw it. So I actually saw the divine in his resistance.
yeah, that's also beautiful. The follow-up question is, when you say start the discussion by asking if someone thinks they have a mission, something beyond themselves, is that in part a way for you to get into essentially code language for there's something called a soul and there's something beyond your material self?
That the soul, or in the language even here, that there's an ayin to your yesh, and you're not
Mhm.
just a self-made. The artist. There's an artist that created your art, meaning you. It's all, soul is correct. I don't have a. I mean, I will only use the word soul if it does not confuse the conversation. But I'm not hiding anything. I mean, I also avoid the word God or soul because those are words that often are loaded and doesn't help because the person says, I don't believe in God or whatever. He has a negative experience about God. That's why it's supposed to try to find secular and let's call it innocuous language that nobody will jump on, that's not loaded, that doesn't have any preconceived notions and stereotypes. That's just a matter of good communication, in my opinion.
100%. Thank you.
So in
I
general,
would
that's the way to
say,
speak to someone because it's about how to, talk about nefesh elikis and nefesh habamis, which is where this is going to end up going. The nefesh habamis has certain language you'll understand and certain language it won't. You have to know how to wisely explain it to the nefesh habamis that it could say, okay, I can get that, I can understand that. I mean, I can go on and on with
Of
explanations.
course.
I mean, love is always a good explanation because that type of person who's self-absorbed, the next question I would ask them is, what about love? Do you love anyone in your life more than yourself? And many people don't like to admit that they do, that they don't. So, they'll say, yes, I love my wife, I love my husband, I love my children. But then, okay, so how is that possible? How are you loving something more than yourself? You put yourself, you'll inconvenience yourself for the care for somebody else. You'll sacrifice. So it goes into the whole a person's life. Are you ready to sacrifice? Are you ready to do something beyond your own complete self? That to me is the yesh. Trying to get the yesh to discover there's something more than just your yesh, in the language that we're learning here, and then you start climbing higher and higher.
Beautiful.
I think that there is here one more, I don't know how to call it, layer, because the bottom line is, yes, the question is how are we perceiving it, how are we looking at it? But the bottom line, there is no we. The creation is the helm, the feeling that there is a we. There is no we.
Yeah, but the question is whether we're on that level to be aware of that. And remember, from Atzmus' point of view, there is another entity. However, that entity is Atzmus. It's just, so to speak, another form, because he did create existence. So I'm not sure when you say we, you mean we as a separate entity, or you mean that we exist, period? It doesn't say here that we don't
You said
exist.
it. You said it in one sentence. There is another entity which is Atzmus, which is
Correct.
not
And
another
from our
entity.
perspective, it appears separate from Atzmus. From
Right.
Atzmus' perspective, it's not. In reality, it's not. But both are true, because remember that Tzimtzum is also true. Tzimtzum is not a mirage. It's not a sleight of hand. It's not like a magic trick. It's a real Tzimtzum. God has a power to conceal. Because remember, God is not defined by Gilui. So the fact that we are aware of God or not aware does not change. God, in other words, God is not defined by revelation. So it means his Tzimtzum is just as real as his revelation. Part of the whole discussion. We'll talk about it more.
I was
I
just
like
going to
this
say,
line.
It's not simple matter. Let me put it this way. This requires plenty of thought and talking and reviewing. And
Right.
because you're dealing here now the highest levels of reconciling existence with godliness, which of course is the central theme. And
right.
it's very exciting, but you can imagine it's you got to go step by step by step.
I mean, there's an inherent tension here that always exists for us, which doesn't really exist for Hashem, if I'm interpreting this correctly. But that's quantum. We have to accept that, because we have to understand that we are distinct to ourselves, and yet we are not, in the sense of
Well,
that
I have a lot to say about that, especially with quantum. Look, when two people love each other, I'm talking about a healthy love, where not one is dominating and the other is being annihilated or something, but two people truly love each other. So there's the expression in the Torah that talks about intimacy. V'hoya lebasar echad, that Adam and Chava were one entity, Zocher nekeva, male, female. God separated them, and then said, "You will meet each other, and then join together to become one flesh," which is the ultimate of sexuality and intimacy. In the healthiest form of it, when two people are truly intimate, they somewhat transcend their consciousness, meaning their separation. That's what true love is. True love is to the point you don't even feel your ego, or even feel yourself for that matter, to the point that you can love someone, and in that moment, it's as if two have become one. One second, let me just finish what I'm saying. Now, you still exist. You didn't disappear. Someone from the outside still sees two people. And yet, there's an experience where you become so transcendent, or I guess absorbed into a higher truth, a higher reality. Not one has become the other. Both have elevated to something that's beyond. Like I've talked many times about, when you read a book, you get so absorbed, you don't even realize you're turning pages. You literally don't even realize you're reading a book, because you've lost the object and subject have become one. So we all can find examples of that. But imagine living like that 24/7. Then you're talking about someone that has become so absorbed in divine consciousness that they exist at the same time they don't have any sense of their existence.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just one way to explain it. There are other ways to talk about it. We just are not, we in general are frankly not developed, we've not matured and developed, we've not been taught even to reach such levels. We live in a world where we're taught to be selfish, to be honest, to take care of yourself. And consciousness is considered a whole advantage. In this context, what I just said, consciousness is actually blindness. It means you're conscious of something, when in truth, if you were really one with it, you wouldn't be conscious of it. Like I always say, does a fish get wet? Does water get wet? Water is wetness. The fact that it's getting wet means it's dry. A dry thing gets wet. But if you're one with it, like we say, Mola Aretz Deis Hashem K'mayim Liyam Mechasim, the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea, like the fish in water. Then it's not even a matter of two entities. It's one entity, even though there are fish. but their experience is completely the water, like in the love example I gave. I'm just giving examples. Even this, I would not say is the fullest experience from Atzmus' point of view, but it's a taste of something that's more than just basically you and I, and we have some relationship, but we never really become one. Follow what I'm saying?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Rabbi. Exactly. Punkt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's why I think each of us can find examples of this type of experience in our lives. We have to find examples. That's how you always begin. Because without examples, it becomes abstract, mechanical structures that are very hard to imagine. We have to find something in our lives that say, here's a point where I was so absorbed in something that I lost myself, so to speak. I lost my sense of self in a good way.
Right.
I
When
hope
you're
that
creating.
that's a bit helpful.
Totally. Yeah. So like when you're in the middle of creating something and you lose your sense of time and your self-consciousness, as you said. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's, by the way, why Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, before they ate from the tree of knowledge, were naked and they weren't even conscious of it. It's like a newborn child. Why should a child be conscious of their own sexuality? There's nothing, it's part of who I am. It's just part of existence. It's just who I am. There was no self that said, oh, I have shame, or I did something wrong, or I could do something wrong, or, there's me. They were not separate. Their whole being was consumed with a divine consciousness of their purpose in life. So what's the difference between your eyes or your sexuality in that sense? It's all part of who you are. But then the Eitz Hadas, that's what Das is. They intimately experienced right and wrong, good and evil. Now there's an independent consciousness that suddenly senses. And when you sense things, you become conscious. Now, it's better to be conscious than not, and than not to be. But consciousness already is a step outside of you've left the waters of the total seamless unity. Yeah, I think that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we'll stop here. So we're on top of page 1477, and yeah, much to be said, but give it thought. Listen, work at it, read it. I'll do my best to try to explain. But ultimately, no one can replace your own efforts in trying to assimilate these ideas. If you tell me that today, you were hard to concentrate on your work because all of this was very so compelling, that would be a good sign. Even though I don't want to say that anybody should have a confused day, but learning this, and if you feel like it's like really hard to access, it's elusive, is actually a good sign. That's the first step toward getting it, if I may say so.
I think you said that the first time around as well. I know you didn't mean to do it again, but you did.
I did the first time when I taught
Yeah,
this?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so at least I'm consistent.
You're consistent.
It's true. It's just truth, right? It's true. So
No, I feel that, when I start talking about it, it becomes hard to concentrate on other things because this is like the essence of it all.
Yeah. No puns
But we do have
intended.
to go, but God wants us to go out of the ark, chutz, like he says, chutz la'atzmus, yitziv yizgalus, and that's the chiddush here. Remember, look at the power of this. That God senses all this unity. Okay, obvious, but that begin as an true independent entity with its tzimtzum and all, should come to such type of a level of absorbing, becoming one with God. That's quite an achievement.
Is that the Mila of the Yemosa Mashiach over
Absolutely.
pre-garden,
That's
pre-Eitz, pre-Chet HaEtz?
exactly right. Yes, that's exactly the mila. It's not even that. It's a mila even on a lakus before the tzimtzum. Because before the tzimtzum, there was nothing else. So of course everything is unified. It's only after the tzimtzum that this is possible, and that's the kavana, the transformation of the tzimtzum, which is so central to Ayin Beis, which is what we're learning.
Yeah, so beautiful.
Yep.
Elokus, after the Tzimtzum, create the klipas even before the Chet Eitz Hadas, which
Yeah,
in
but then it
Tzif
was
is
klipa
also
shemer lepri.
Elokus.
Yeah, but that's only in the sinas mokim because klipa shemer lepri. It's once you feel the klipa is separate from the pri, from the fruit. That's when the problems begin. The world itself is not the problem. The world is a keli telekus. It's when we see ourselves as separate and start having our own agenda. Okay, let me stop here. Top of page 1477. I'm going to stop the recording if I may.